I know is a very busy time of the year for sure. So I am excited to share. Let me get rid of that message. I'm excited to share my experience at Pukaskwa, which was wonderful. So my name is Joanna Hodge, and I am a professor of geology at Fleming College. So I'm in Lindsay, Ontario. It is one of the satellite campuses of Fleming College, but we like to consider it to be the main campus, the School of Environmental and Natural Resource Sciences. So I am a professional geoscientist, and my background is in mineral exploration geology. So I did that for 10 years before I moved to snowy Ontario to take up a position teaching with Fleming College. I would describe myself, and probably some of my friends also would, as a bit of a rock nerd. And as Carrie Ann said in the introduction, I am from New Zealand. So that's where I got my love of geology from. And although it is quite different to the geology here of Canada, I have managed to be able to make that transformation. So today I'm going to speak about the Geologist in Residence program at Pukaskwa National Park, which is sponsored by Parks Canada, the Canadian Federation of Earth Sciences, and the APGO Education Foundation. So I'm going to talk about the program itself and explain what it is about. I'm going to talk about my experience at Pukaskwa and touch a little bit on the importance of geoscience outreach, because it's not always something that we as geologists do particularly well, but I do think it is incredibly important. And this Geologist in Residence program is a really fantastic contribution to geological outreach. I'll share a couple of final thoughts, and there'll be some opportunities for questions as well. Now, if you have questions, feel free to put your little digital hand up. I will probably not see it, but maybe Carrie Ann, if somebody has a question, you could let me know, and we can address some of those things as they come up.
Yeah, they can also put the questions in the chat too, and I'll keep an eye on that.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So I am coming to you today from Kirkfield, which is home to the Mississauga Anishinaabe and is in the traditional territory of the Williams Treaties. So I am an immigrant to the territory, and as such, I'm grateful for the opportunity to live and work here and to honor the teachings of the Mishisagig, who have been stewards and caretakers of this land for countless generations. And what is now Pukaskwa National Park lies on the traditional territory of the Bigtigong Anishinaabe and the Netmizag Amig Anishinaabe. It falls within the Robinson Superior Treaty area and has been traveled for hundreds of years by Métis people of the North Shore of Lake Superior. So I'd like to recognize and respect the historic connections of Indigenous peoples to the park and honor the ongoing connection that Anishinaabe and Métis people have to this land. So the Geologist in Residence program is a collaboration between Parks Canada and the Canadian Federation of Earth Sciences to educate visitors and Pukaskwa staff about the geological landscape, the geological features, the formations, and the phenomena of the park. It's financially supported by the APGO Education Foundation, and 2023 was the second year that it was offered, for which I am extremely grateful, because I did get to build on work that last year's Geologist in Residence had done at the park. So the main goals of the program are to increase the awareness and appreciation that the public has for geoscience in general, and also the geological features of the park. It has some spectacular landscape, and many people come to see these beautiful places, but they don't necessarily connect with the geology, which is, after all, the foundation of everything that they see in the park. One of the other program goal was to improve the ability that Parks Canada has to connect with visitors and engage them in those geological features of the park. So I spent time with members of the public and also members of park staff to increase that public awareness and also to sort of improve those abilities to make connections with visitors. So the objectives of the program were to offer a 2-week opportunity to a geologist, and the scope for the geologist was quite broad, but the opportunity was to get practical field experience at Pukaskwa National Park sometime in the late summer. So this was a residency that I took part in at the end of August. The other objective was to provide opportunities for staff and visitors to learn from a geoscience professional, so an earth science specialist, a geologist, while I was there in my volunteer placement at Pukaskwa National Park. So as part of the description of the experience, there was a scope of work, and there was a requirement of various events and opportunities that had to be met as part of that residency program. So there were 4 kinds of visitor engagement and education activities for 6 or more events. So what we ended up conducting were 2 drop-in hours at my campground to communicate the geology of the park to visitors, 2 guided hikes in the front country, or some other opportunity that was supported by a park interpreter, but we opted for the guided hikes. And then there were information sessions on the geology of the park to the park staff. So I had my scope of work, I had, you know, the goals and the objectives. So with all of these things in mind, I packed up all of my geology equipment and my camper van, and I headed 1,100 kilometers north to get set up at Pukaskwa and deliver this experience. And just a little piece of it's pretty funny. So I'm from New Zealand. It's not a very big country. And when I was speaking to my mother, she said, "Well, how far do you have to go for this?" And I said, "Oh, it's not particularly far. It's 1,100 kilometers. It's just a couple of days of driving." So you can get from the top of New Zealand to the bottom of New Zealand and halfway back again in 1,100 kilometers and 2 days of driving. So she thought it was pretty entertaining that now that I've been in Canada for 16 years, I think 1,100 kilometers, no problem. We'll just pop up the road and, go do some geology for fun. So 2023 was the second year that the Geologist in Residence program was offered. Victoria Stinson was the inaugural Geologist in Residence, and she participated in the program in 2022. So it was great for me because she had done a whole lot of work on the park in advance. And one of the things that she got to do, which is not particularly common in a national park, is to collect rock samples. So she spent a couple of days traveling around in the park boat with some folks from the park collecting different samples, and she compiled a rock library for the park. So I had those samples available to me, which was wonderful. I got to use them in a couple of the different experiences, but I also was able to visit the outcrops that she sampled, so I could familiarize myself with the local geology, which was fantastic. So it was super helpful to be able to build on her residency and put together this experience. So the first week was an orientation week, and I spent the time getting familiar with the park and the surrounds. Now, I had never been there before, although I had been to Northern Lake Superior. So I did have to become familiar with the geography and the geology. And I also wanted to think about the best way to engage the public. So we as geoscientists often get very wrapped up in how interesting our own stuff is. And we don't necessarily think about the best way to communicate that science to non-geoscientists. And I know it's hard to believe, but not everybody is enraptured with rocks. I struggle with that concept, but nonetheless. Having said that, though, people do come to Pukaskwa for specific reasons and interests. And I wanted to find out from those folks what that was. Why did they actually come to the park? So there weren't any offerings to the public in the first week, but I did spend time at the visitors center with Carly Robiard, who is the parks interpreter, and she was my supervisor for the 2-week period. And we spoke to some folks who were there. We engaged with the public, asked them what their interests were. And I also walked around the trails, the front country trails, looking for those hooks, looking for those things that might be really interesting to people, and what it is that they might want to engage in from sort of a geoscience, parks, intersectional perspective. So when I met people, I asked them, how come you're here in the park? What is it that you want to do? And the answers were really varied. People came to go paddling, they were doing biking, hiking, boating. People were hiking the front country trails, which is where we focused our energy, but they were also on some of the back country trails. People came here to go fishing. There were people, brave and hardy souls, who were swimming at the sandy beaches because Lake Superior is not particularly warm. But every single one of them that I spoke to was there to spend some time in nature and experience the wilds of Lake Superior. Nobody specifically mentioned geology, which is unsurprising. So my goal was to connect geology to those interests that the visitors came to the park with and come up with a thesis statement that would guide the way that we conducted the outreach experience in week 2. So one of the things that people don't tend to realize is that everything is connected, and the things that they love to see and do at the park are directly linked to the geology and the geological processes that formed the landscape. So I took the answers to the questions that I had asked of people visiting to the park, and I worked with Carly Robiard to come up with a thesis statement that would guide the experience. And what we developed for the residency was, how does 2.7 billion years of geological evolution inform the park's ecosystems? So a little bit of a spoiler alert, the picture in this slide here is an encrusted saxifrage. So that is an Arctic disjunct plant whose normal range is much, much further north. And it grows at Pukaskwa because of the geology and because of the climate. And so that actually became part of the experience. We had some people who were coming to photograph plants, those kinds of things. So we'll take a look at that encrusted saxifrage again in a few minutes, and you'll learn why it is that it thrives in an area that is further to the south. So Carly and I devised a plan for outreach that would engage the public, but it was also important to connect to the park staff. So there are a lot of folks who work at the park. They are the ones who engage with the public every day, but they have very diverse backgrounds. Biology, science communication, just about anything except geology. So Carly has a graduate diploma in science communication, and she was wonderfully helpful. So she provided the acronym POETRY as the guiding document. And the reason that I included it here is because as scientists who will likely need to communicate more and more our science to the public, it's something that we could probably all use. So I will speak to the need for better geoscience communication later in the talk, but poetry was essentially the framework around which I built the experience. So what is the purpose? What are we doing? Who are we trying to reach and why? And that differed a little bit depending on the activity. The goal for the focused education sessions was different to the drop-in sessions and to the guided hikes, but primarily, you know, we had that overlying thesis statement that guided everything we did. Had to be organized, of course. Otherwise, I would be hiking for 6 hours, you know, chatting about all sorts of things and not really getting to the point. And it also had to be enjoyable. So, you know, we didn't want to be dragging people kicking and screaming around the park looking at rocks. We wanted them to actually have a fun time. So education should be enjoyable, whether it's formal or informal. And the thesis statement that we developed was about connection, which hopefully would tie into that enjoyable piece. It needed to be relatable, so we had to connect it to the experiences that people brought with them. And the last piece of the puzzle was me. So those were the experiences that I brought to the program and could share with visitors and with staff. So the outreach program that we devised included 2 campsite drop-in sessions, 2 guided hikes of the Southern Headland Trail, and 2 presentations to Pukaskwa Park staff. So I'm going to speak to the public pieces today, the drop-in sessions and the guided hike, but there were presentations for the staff as well. I was also super lucky to have all these other informal conversations with visitors throughout the park in the time that I was on my site. So people were really interested. And if I was wearing my red volunteer t-shirt or my geology cruiser vest, people would stop me and ask me what I was doing. And, you know, we'd have all of these very informal conversations on the outcrops or in the visitor center or wherever it was that we happened to chat. Carly and I also had our few minutes of fame on CFNO, which is the local marathon radio station. And Parks Canada has a weekly spot called What's Up Parks Canada. So when I was there, it was Pukaskwa's time, and we were interviewed on the radio station, got to share the experience. Are there any questions, Carrie-Anne, before we move on, or?
I don't see anything in the chat yet. Nope.
Okay, great.
We're all listening really close. There'll be lots of questions afterwards.
I'm sure. Okay, so one of the things that we held was drop-in sessions at the campground. So the campsite that I was staying in was walking distance from the visitors center. And so these were opportunities for people to just stop by and ask questions. It was a 4-hour period and people could just come in at any time and ask some questions. So I set myself up. You can see on the picnic table here, I've got my lovely tablecloth with the flamingos, and then I have samples from the rock library that Victoria had collected last year. I brought some hand lenses with me. I made some hand-drawn sketches on things like rock types and processes, and I had some reference materials. And I also had Oreo cookies. And it turns out that people really, really like playing with their food and simulating plate tectonics with Oreo cookies. So the visitors at these sessions ranged in age from about 4 to older than 70. And there were people from very, very diverse backgrounds. There were members of the local First Nation. The campground hosts came. There were campers. And there was a group of 9 people who were kayaking. They had sea kayaks fully kitted out. They were going from Pukaskwa to Michipicoten. So that's a 190-kilometer, 10-day trip that they were embarking on. And they wanted to know what kinds of rocks they might expect to see on their 10-day kayak, which kind of makes me want to buy a kayak. Anyway, people dropped in for all sorts of reasons. There were people who came in with unknown rock samples from around the world that they wanted to get identified. And the woman in this picture and her daughter, who are from the local First Nation, wanted to come in and share with me what the cultural significance of rocks were to the Anishinaabe culture. So that was fantastic. That was, you know, a back and forward sharing of knowledge, which was wonderful. I had people come in and ask questions about how glaciation affected the levels in the Great Lakes and how the rocks of the park compared to sleeping giants, which people were quite familiar with and which is not too far up the road. And they had questions about just the geology overall. So the paddlers wanted to know what they could see on their trip. And everybody was very, very excited about the Oreo cookie plate tectonics. So we got to eat a lot of Oreo cookies in the drop-in sessions, and they were very, very popular. So we probably had, I don't know, 20 odd people between the two sessions, just pop in and ask questions. Now, the guided hikes were sort of much larger sessions. They were much more in detail and they were more specific. So with respect to these presentations, and they were offered to the park staff and to the public, I decided to take an Earth systems approach and look for hooks in what visitors to the park were interested in. So were they there to hike? Were they there to go paddling? Were they there for fishing? And I also wanted to show them ways in which the geology underpins the broader ecosystems. And so it was really important for me to meet those visitors, those participants, where they were and with their interests in mind, rather than focusing on pure geology, because I could nerd out over the rocks for hours and hours and hours, but I wanted to make sure that people were still engaged, that they were still interested, and that they were getting something out of it. So as part of our thesis statement, Geology Informs Ecosystems, which was a guide to how we sort of built all of these experiences up, what I delivered on these guided hikes was essentially the evolution of Pukaskwa as a 2.7 billion year old story in 3 acts. So Act 1, building the Wawa terrain, convergent plate tectonics and how the terrain was formed. Act 2, tearing it all apart. So mid-continent rifting, differential weathering, and the formation of the basin that would eventually become Lake Superior. And part 3, which I called Ice Ice Baby, and is probably only relevant to those of you who were listening to music in the 80s, the role of Pleistocene glaciation in forming Lake Superior, and the geological evidence that we see in the park for both erosional and depositional processes that formed the distinctive landforms at Pukaskwa. So we offered the guided hikes on the Southern Headland Trail. It is a 2.2 kilometer front country trail that leaves from the visitors center, and it is listed as moderately difficult. So if you can see my mouse on the screen here, this is the visitors center here. This is the canoe dock area where you can launch your canoes into Hattie Cove here. My campsite was actually just right here, so it was nice and close. And then we had 5 stops. We had basically the introduction, we had some micro ecosystems, we had stop 3 out here on the Southern Headland, stop 4 out here where we were looking at mid-continent rifts, and then we wrapped up here overlooking Horseshoe Bay, so people could move off to the beach if they wanted to do that. They could go back to the campground, or they could head over to the other side of the bay and hike the Manitou-Mikina Trail and put their newfound geological knowledge of the park into practice. So everywhere is beautiful at Pukaskwa, and this was a lovely location up at the Parks Canada Red Chairs overlooking Pulpwood Harbour. So this is where I asked people what their interests were. Why were they participating in the hike? What did they want to learn? And I also got them to get a little bit zen with me, close their eyes, take a bit of a breath, and take a few moments to see, smell, hear, and feel the environment. Just kind of soak up the atmosphere and the nature and really think about what it is that we were surrounded by. So this is where I introduced the concept of Earth system science. So the different spheres, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the geosphere, and the interconnectedness of all of these things, with an emphasis on geology as the keystone in all ecosystems. And this is where I gave them that broad overview of the 3-act play and told them that I would take them to all of the different locations around the Southern Headland Trail and share all of these different pieces that were part of that 2.7 billion years of history. So stop 2 was a little bit of a teaser. So stop 2 is a chasm that was formed from the differential erosion of mid-continent rift dolerite. But we hadn't got to that part of the story yet. So I invited the participants to compare the soil and the vegetation in the chasm compared to what they saw on the bare silicate rock immediately adjacent to it, and then just kind of store it in their brains until we got to stop 4, where they could start making connections with the geological evolution of the park and think about how the chasm might have formed. And I have to say that on both hikes, the groups were wonderful. They were super interested in answering questions. I wish that some of my students were as engaged as some of these visitors were at Pukaskwa. So at stop 3, I introduced the first part of the story, and that is the formation of the Wawa terrain. So at this location, visitors can see these beautiful, highly deformed and sheared pillow lavas that were formed 2.7 billion years ago during the assembly of the Wawa terrain. Now, the Wawa terrain is part of the Superior Province. And it was also a great opportunity to connect folks with modern processes of plate tectonics. So the Wawa terrain formed through subduction processes similar to those that formed the Japan arc. And if nobody's heard of the Wawa terrain or is reasonably unfamiliar with the Superior Province, they're pretty familiar with Japan. Now, there's also some evidence of shearing here. You can see over on the right-hand side of the photograph, just by the water, there is some intensely sheared basalt. And that is the same as the kinds of processes that are occurring at the San Andreas Fault. So being able to connect these ancient processes with modern analogies, particularly things that people are familiar with, like volcanoes and earthquakes, even if they have just a cursory understanding of plate tectonics, made the location really come alive for them. So here's where we get back to that Arctic disjunct story. It was also a location where I could connect people with the things that interest them. So some of them were interested in plants. There were a couple of folks there who were taking nature photographs of the area, and they were super interested in these tiny little plants. So this is an encrusted saxifrage, which is an Arctic plant that shouldn't really occur this far south. But the reason that they do thrive here is partly due to the environment, and it's partly due to the rocks. So on the edge of the lake where we were standing is a cold and foggy microclimate. Even in the summer, it can be quite chilly and gray. It's harsh and it's windy. Even on the warm days, it was pretty chilly. And it receives a lot of frost. So it actually mimics those Arctic climates further north. Now, the plant, interestingly, also prefers to grow on foliated basalt. So the saxifrage, the encrusted saxifrage, is a chalcophile. It is a plant that thrives in calcium-rich environments. Now, these rocks don't contain a lot of calcium. They contain about 10%. But the process of shearing and the subsequent chemical alteration of the rocks liberates enough calcium from the silicate minerals and allows the plants to access the calcium in the rock. So without the plate tectonics, without the basalt, without that cold, foggy climate, the photographers wouldn't be able to take lovely pictures of these encrusted Arctic saxifrage, and people wouldn't be seeing these very pretty, super interesting plants in an environment that would normally be further to the north. There were also some scuba divers in the park the day that we conducted the second hike. Now, they were wearing dry suits, fortunately, because Lake Superior is not particularly warm. So they were out there looking for whatever it is that they were looking for in the lake. But I asked visitors what they noticed about the water, and they all observed that it was extremely clear. So that's why it's such a beautiful place for paddling and such a wonderful place for diving. You can see all of these beautiful underwater formations. And in fact, in this location here, you could see these very thick quartz veins that were extending from the land down underneath the water into these underwater outcrops. So the thing that makes this lake so wonderful for diving and for paddling and these recreational activities is a function of the silicate rocks. They don't break down particularly easily. They're not as vulnerable to chemical weathering as rocks like limestone or shale are. So the water contains low dissolved solids, and it doesn't have very many nutrients, so plants don't grow in it, and that contributes to the clarity. But it does make it vulnerable to acidification through climate change and pollution. So, you know, there's always a bit of a trade-off. Now, stop 4 is where the story of the formation of Lake Superior really started. So at this location, we looked at mid-continent rift dikes, which is Act 2 of the geologic evolution of Pukaskwa National Park. So this bronze-colored dike here is part of a 1.1 billion-year-old mid-continent rift rock suite that is very, very prominent in northern Lake Superior. And it was here that I asked people, how do you think the chasm seen at Stop 2 formed? And I was very, very impressed at the person who whipped up their hand and said, I bet it weathers a whole lot more quickly than the other stuff around it. I was like, differential weathering, you're a rock star. So we did discuss how these different rocks weather at different rates depending on their composition. And that set the stage for the final act of the play, glaciation, and how differential weathering of the mid-continent rift and its associated sedimentary basin rocks led to the formation of Lake Superior. So the final stop on the guided hike was this outcrop. Now, this is part of the Wawa terrain that is overlooking Horseshoe Bay. And across the bay on the other side is there's a different hike over there, Manitou Mikina, sorry. You can actually see in this picture, this is one of my geology students who stopped in at Pukaskwa on her way back to school from Thunder Bay to stop in and say hi, and her dog. But what you can also see is that the rocks in this location are grooved. You can see that there are sort of these smooth humps. And if you can look at them closely, there are parallel scratches. Now, the scratches and the grooves were formed by glaciation during the Pleistocene. In this particular image, this is the southwest in this direction here to the top left of the picture. And so those grooves and those striations indicate the direction of glacial advance. And so this glaciation during the Pleistocene was the final act in the formation of the park. So although the rocks themselves are ancient, the lake is young. and it didn't form until glaciation during the last ice age gouged out those much, much softer mid-continent rift rocks and the associated sedimentary basin rocks. And what that left behind was a very deep depression that filled during the last glacial retreat around 10,000 years ago. So Lake Superior is the third largest in the world by volume, although we Canadians tend to prefer the largest by surface area statistic. It is deep. It is over 400 meters at its deepest, and it's cold, 4 degrees Celsius at depth. Although the surface water does warm up marginally in the summer. Now, I have swum in Lake Superior once. I would not voluntarily choose to do it again. It is very, very cold. So it is for brave and hardy people only, or if you come with your dry suit. But it's ideal habitat for salmonid fish species, so trout and salmon, who thrive in cold water. We had some people who were there to fish, and so steelhead trout, which is one of the large fish species that Lake Superior is known for, is actually the same species as rainbow trout, but it is 5 to 20 times larger in Lake Superior because of the size and the temperature of the lake. So this is also the location where we wrapped up the hike. I summarized the story. I gave the participants the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback before they headed off to the beach or the campground or another hike, and really, really emphasized that the geology, the rocks under their feet that they were standing on are the literal bedrock of the ecosystems that we see around us, and those ecosystems that they enjoyed during their visit to Pukaskwa. So the response to all of these activities, and particularly the hikes, was fantastic. People were interested and they were super engaged. They asked a whole lot of questions. We were probably there for 30 to 40 minutes at the end of the hike, just having conversations and engaging with people, answering their questions. And there was a lot of desire for a deeper understanding of geological processes, including things like plate tectonics. I met with several people at other times throughout my residency there who had attended one of the hikes, and they all said how much they loved it and how much they learned and how they looked at things in a completely different way because they had this geological perspective on all of these things that they loved and they enjoyed. And this woman here sitting next to me, Diane, came on the hike and she took notes, and her partner could not make it on the hike that day. He was doing some work, so she took him on the same hike and stopped in all of the places, told all of the stories, even made him close his eyes and, you know, breathe in the environment at stop one at the red chairs. So the engagement and the response was fantastic, which tells me that there is a real appetite for this kind of engagement, that people are keen and interested in knowledge. So the last part of the residency program for me was the deliverables. So there was a final report that I wrote for the sponsors, and Carly had also asked me to put together a report on the rock library. So they had in the park a better sense of how the samples that had been collected in 2022 actually related to the story and how they were significant, so that they could use them in the visitors center in a more impactful way. I did put together a hike guide for the park staff for the Southern Headland Trail, so that if people came and asked questions or wanted information, they could provide that information to them. And then I had taken thousands of photographs, so I provided those to the sponsors, gave them the presentation that I had delivered to the park staff. And then there was also a blog post that was published on the APGO Education Foundation website. So there's a real appetite amongst the public for geoscience engagement that connects to their interests and values. Participants on the hikes were interested and engaged, as were the people who came to the drop-in sessions. They had questions, they had very deep and insightful questions and some very technical questions that showed a desire for a much deeper understanding of geology, geologic processes, the relationships to ecosystems, those kinds of things. But we as geoscientists are not always good at meeting people where they are. We, and I definitely include myself on this list, get bogged down in very, very technical things that don't have any connection to the lived experiences of the public. And we get bogged down in all of those things. So that leads to disengagement and disinterest amongst the folks that you're communicating with. So I think it's very important to know your audience and target your content accordingly. And that is something that I still need to work on, but it's an ongoing piece. As to why it is important that we figure this out, well, society, as we know, we just need to look at the news, is faced with many wicked problems, including things like climate change, food insecurity, and access to clean water. And we as geoscientists have the opportunity to contribute to solving those problems. But the public in general has a very narrow view of geoscience and geology. If they think about it at all, they mostly equate it with mining. Mining has its own image problem, which is something that we also need to work on. And I recently discovered that oil and gas is considered more favorable than mining, and which just kind of blows my mind. I'm not sure I struggle to believe that. Unfortunately, there is a huge demand for qualified people in the geoscience field, geologists and technicians, but colleges and universities globally are cancelling geoscience programs. They cite declining enrollment, despite the push to things like a carbon neutral future and a green economy. I mean, we only need to look at Ontario to see where that push is coming from. And so, it's super important that we as a community engage and try and change some of those perceptions and contribute to solving some of these wicked problems. So the Geologist in Residence program is an excellent part of that larger story. And I am extremely grateful to Parks Canada, CFES, and the APGO Education Foundation for my opportunity to contribute to that small part of geoscience education outreach. So I would particularly like to thank Carly Robillard and Amy Mackey from Parks Canada, who gave me a very warm welcome at Pukaskwa, and they were extremely helpful for the 2 weeks that I was in residence. I would also like to thank Leslie Hymers and Beth McClarty-Halfkenny, both of whom are here today. Thank you so much for their guidance and support before, during, and after the program. The program wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the hard work of these folks and the collaboration of the Canadian Federation of Earth Sciences, Parks Canada, and the APGO Education Foundation, who brought this all to fruition. So the Geologist in Residence program was an exceptional experience. I got to share a lot of my knowledge, but I also got to learn a lot from the people that I engaged with. And it was amazing. Highly recommend. So if you have the opportunity to engage in something like this in the future, I would suggest that you grab that opportunity with both hands. You'll get to share a lot of your knowledge, but you'll get to learn a lot from the folks that you meet and that you share with as well. So thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, I am happy to take them.